welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. In this episode, Jim Goldgeier and Derek Chollet discuss the arc post-Cold War American foreign policy. Their talk, recorded at the University of Texas Clements Center Summer Seminar on Diplomacy and Statecraft held in Beaver Creek, Colorado, builds on their book, From 11/9 to 9/11, American Between the Wars. In this case, they've added a second 11/9, referring to November 9th, 2016, the day after the election of Donald Trump. Goldgeier, a professor and former dean of the American University School of International Service, and Chollet, currently serving as executive vice president of the German Marshall Fund, illuminate their discussion based on their experience within the administrations during this period.
So 11/9 to 9/11 to 11/9. The first part of that was the subject of this book that Derek and I wrote, as Mark mentioned. And, it was sort of the mid-2000s, and we were both teaching American foreign policy and talking about sort of what we were using for our classes and bemoaning the fact that, there was a lot that had been written, of course, on the Cold War and continued to be written on the Cold War. And then there was a lot that was being written on post-9/11. Everything's changed. And, it's like, well, what do you use for the period between the fall of the wall and September 11th? Well, I don't know. What's good? What do you use? And then it's like, well, maybe we should write a book on it so that we have something to use. And, really felt very strongly that for the people who were just saying that everything began on September 11, 2001, in American foreign policy, it would be kind of important to understand sort of some of the backdrop to that and what occurred after the end of the Cold War. So we set out to do that, and so our bookends were November 9th, 1989, fall of the wall, and then 9/11, September 11, 2001. And for purposes of this talk, we'll go to 11/9, 2016, because the election of Donald Trump certainly shapes the kinds of things that we talked about in the book. So I'll talk about the first part and then turn it over to Derek to talk about the Obama and Trump years. What we tried to do in the book was to talk about the interplay between ideas and politics and resulting policy. And what was interesting to us was how much the end of the Cold War shaped the Republican and Democratic parties and the challenges posed for the Republican Party and the opportunities that were now available to the Democratic Party. So we'll start with the Republican side. You had, of course, at the time of the fall of the wall, the Republican administration of George H.W. Bush. And you look back at that period, that group, Bush, Scowcroft, Baker, et cetera, sort of the traditional Republican, conservative, internationalist, belief in American power, belief in international institutions, American leadership through international institutions. And, George H.W., in the aftermath of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and the ability to form a joint statement with the Soviet Union against condemning that invasion, spoke about a new world order. But what he was really talking about was making the old order work. He had served, he's the only president to have served as ambassador to the United Nations, and it was really about making that finally worked the way it was intended to, now that the Soviets were no longer going to block everything that the United States did. And so, and the response to the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, this was everything that the founders of the UN system could have wanted, right? A strong country invades its weaker neighbor, and the international community, United States, leads an international coalition to ensure that invasion did not stand. Jeff Engel's written a really excellent book on that administration, and one of the things I wrote in a review of it for H. Diplo was and I've told Jeff this, I just felt so sad when I read that book. Where did, a couple of them, were here this week, of course, but, where is that part of the Republican Party? They're not operating today. So, except on the sidelines. So, and they weren't the only part of the Republican Party at that time. Because what had happened was the Cold War, anti-communism was the glue that held the Republican Party together in the latter half of the Cold War. Whatever other divisions they had within the party, they were all on board with a strong national security policy against the Soviet Union. And what's the problem when the communist regimes collapsed between 89 and 91, including the Soviet regime? You know, if anti-communism is the glue that holds your party together, anti-communism isn't there to hold the party together anymore. And so you see this splintering. So you had the Bush team. Then you had, on the other end, you had sort of the isolationist impulse. More familiar with it today, but you know, you had this, at that time it was embodied by the television commentator and former Nixon speechwriter who ran for president in 1992 against George H.W. Bush for the Republican nomination, Pat Buchanan, whose strong showing in the New Hampshire primary spooked the Bush team into thinking it shouldn't talk about the one thing George H.W. Bush was really good at, which was conducting foreign policy. And Buchanan talked about America first. In fact, he talked about America first and second and third. His campaign slogan was "Come Home, America," which was the same slogan that George McGovern had used in 1972 in the campaign against Richard Nixon, who, you know, Pat Buchanan had been speechwriter for. In fact, Derek and I, when we met with Buchanan for the book, you know, we said, you know, we noticed you used the same slogan that George McGovern had used. And he said he'd gotten a very nice letter from McGovern during the campaign saying, you know, see, you're using my slogan and, you know, good luck with it. You know, hope it works out better for you than it did for me. And Buchanan said he sent a nice note back to McGovern saying, Senator, you know, we couldn't come home in 1972. We have to come home in 1992. And this is basically, we did our thing. We defeated the Soviet Union. Time to focus on the United States. Bring the troops home, focus on domestic affairs. You also had the emergence, I mean, they had been there before, but sort of in opposition to the Bush team, the neoconservatives. Neoconservatives largely had been Democrats earlier in their lives, you know, not happy with the direction of the Democratic Party in the latter half of the Cold War, supported Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 84, and then George H.W. in 1988, and especially sort of the Reagan, you know, what really motivated them, especially after the end of the Cold War, was belief in the importance of America promoting democracy. And, you know, for a number of them, the way they sort of looked at it was that America and the Republican Party were really only great when they had a really great sort of mission and project. And this was true of Teddy Roosevelt and true of Ronald Reagan. And they wanted to see the United States in the aftermath of the Cold War take on democracy promotion as the major theme of American foreign policy. And then there was a group that we called the hard nationalists. There's some overlap with the isolationist group, but this was, we focused on what we called the contract Republicans, the Republicans who ran in 1994 on the contract with America, taking over both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years for the Republicans. They were led by Newt Gingrich, who really was more, as I'll talk about in a moment, more like Bill Clinton than he was like them. I mean, he was more of a sort of liberal internationalist than he was like his caucus, and we talked with him about that for the book and just his struggle with a caucus that was really, they weren't motivated by too many foreign policy issues. They had a weird thing about U.S. troops not serving under UN command, which wasn't a thing anyway, but they made it a thing. NATO enlargement was part of the contract. Certainly strong military was very important to them, and there were a few other ancillary issues. So they weren't isolationist, but you know, it was sort of a muscular foreign policy, but not it wasn't really a foreign policy of engagement. It certainly wasn't like the neoconservatives or the Bush team. And so you have those divisions. Of course, those divisions get exacerbated by the fact that George H.W. loses in 1992, and then you have the Republicans out of power for 8 years. In the book, we close with the divisions that still existed within the Republican Party, even after September 11th. September 11th was a potential moment for unity again in the party. If anti-communism was the glue that held the party together in the Cold War, anti-Islamic extremism was seen by many Republicans as a potential new glue to bring the Republicans together. But it lasts for a moment, but not much longer. Partly over the Iraq War, when the realists and neoconservatives split, right? The realists arguing, this makes no sense. You had Scowcroft and James Baker in the summer of 2002 arguing against potential war with Iraq. The neoconservatives arguing that the only problem with the Iraq War was that the U.S. didn't do more, and it would have been the big success and the democracy game changer that they had hoped for. So it was the Iraq War, and that was also one of the things we found in the interviews was the split over the global war on terror, which Aaron was talking about yesterday. Huge disagreements emerged even within the Bush 43 team over the notion of what that even meant and what U.S. foreign policy should be. So that's the Republican Party, and we'll come back to them in a few minutes. The Democratic side, if the collapse of communism and the loss of that anti-communism as a glue was a challenge for the Republicans, oh, what a sense of relief on the Democratic side, right? Because for the Democrats, the problem had been they were viewed as too soft on communism. They were viewed as not robust enough to be entrusted with American national security. In fact, I think it's worth noting, because it's really hard for people who weren't politically alive and aware at the time, to remember that after the 1988 election, when Bush 41 won that election, there were many people who believed the Democrats would never win the presidency again. That Nixon, Ford, that Carter had been a fluke, Watergate enabled him to win, Reagan, the landslides, Bush, that basically because the Republicans were seen as the party of national security, hard to believe, but they were seen as the party of national security and, as I said, embodied by what Bush Sr. did during his 4 years. It would seem like, how would the Democrats win a national election? But guess what? Just like anti-communism as a glue doesn't work, soft on communism as a thing to beat the Democrats over the head with, 1992, Soviet Union's gone, who cares, right? Doesn't matter anymore. So all of a sudden, there's a huge opportunity for the Democratic Party. Now, of course, foreign policy didn't really matter in the 1992 campaign. But it's just one of the things we do in the book is raise three themes that emerge in the Clinton years that'll help with the story as we come to the more recent period. First of all, Clinton was a huge believer in what globalization, the impact of globalization, the belief that you could no longer separate out the domestic and the international economy. That may seem like, well, no duh, but this was very controversial when he ran. In fact, the Republicans used to say that, this was all globaloney, that he was just, making up this, where things were going. But one of the things he was very keen on was that it wasn't just about him winning the presidency, which obviously was a big deal for him, but moving the Democratic Party from where it had been sitting on the left into the center. And part of moving it to the center was on economic issues, positioning itself as supporting free trade. And one of the signature moments comes in the first year of his presidency when the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated by the Bush administration, was passed in the Congress in 1993, thanks to Clinton working with Newt Gingrich to get that thing through the Congress, and was seen at the time, important also for our later story of the Democratic Party, seen at the time as a huge signature achievement for Bill Clinton, as would later in his presidency be the bringing China into the World Trade Organization, creation, the establishment of the WTO and bringing China in. So free trade emerges as a theme for him. Probably not so important for him, but becomes very important for his administration, was important for people around him, important for people around him during the campaign, was democracy promotion. And this was a way to sort of stand in distinction to the Bush senior team, which, for many seemed like it was not so interested. And, there was a lot of, sort of using the butchers of Beijing and the failure of the Bush administration to do anything about the Tiananmen Square events of 1989. Doing nothing about the Balkans, and being slow to recognize the breakup of the Soviet Union. And part of this was a play. Part of this was because the people around him believed in this stuff, but part of it was a political play. I mentioned the neoconservatives before. Former Democrats became Republican, or at least supported Republicans. This was a play by people around Clinton to try to woo those people back to the Democratic Party. And they went hard after a number of them. And democracy promotion does become a major theme of the Clinton years. The national security strategy of 1994 on democratic engagement and enlargement, things like NATO enlargement to help bring democracy to Central and Eastern Europe. And it particularly becomes a big theme in the second term with Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State. And then you had issues, the third thing, is issues related to the use of force. Real challenge for Democrats post-Vietnam, where the military was seen as the problem, not the solution to problems. And Democrats very uncomfortable with the use of American force. But what occurs in the 90s is it all comes together for them so beautifully because they can think about the use of force for humanitarian purposes. The use of force to do good. They don't have to get wrapped up in discussions of the use of force in the service of American national interests. They can talk about it for the use of humanitarian purposes. And this really culminates in the 1999 Kosovo War, where you have the emergence of what have become known as the liberal hawks, also important for the later story, who support Kosovo, the war in Kosovo. And this is also true of Clinton's colleagues elsewhere in Europe, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schroeder, again, people who had, opposed the Vietnam War, and now all of a sudden they're saying we need to use air power to protect this population in Kosovo. And the beauty was for them, right, we can bomb from 15,000 feet and suffer no American casualties. So it seemed like everything was going their way. And in fact, in November of 1999, on the 10th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Bill Clinton went to his alma mater, Georgetown University, gave a speech in which he said, "We are now at the height of our power and prosperity." Now, he didn't mean height as in it's going to go downhill from here. That's what happened. But he meant height as in, man, the future looks great. And I think these three themes, the free trade, democracy promotion, and use of force for humanitarian purposes, these are things that would have fit very comfortably if the election of 2000 had gone differently and Al Gore became president. But he didn't. And by the time Obama comes in, you have an Iraq war that's discrediting the Bush freedom agenda. You have a financial crisis, which is leading to tremendous rethink of previous economic policies. And the Democratic Party by 2008 is in a somewhat different position. And of course, the Republican Party, compared to where it was earlier, where the isolationists, sort of hard nationalists, were one faction, but kept over in the corner, become unleashed in the 2016 campaign. And for that, we'll hear from Derek.
So first I should say it's great to be here. This is my third time at this conference. I want to thank Aaron and Mark and Bowden in absentia for having me back. In this line of work, you get to go to a lot of conferences, and this is one of my favorites. And it's because of all of you. You're inspiring to get to know, to get to work with down the road, and having been at this now a few times over the years, I've now professionally worked with folks who are at this conference, sit around this table 4 years ago. And also what's fun about it is I find myself always reflecting on my own career and my own journey and how I got to do what I do. And you think about mentorship, and it's important to note, I think Jim and I met when I was a sophomore in college, and he was a newly minted assistant professor out of Berkeley at Cornell. And we worked together on it was an independent study project. I faxed him a letter from my dad's office in Nebraska, where I grew up, during a winter break to ask if he would be willing. I had gotten advice from someone. I can't remember what wise professor gave me this advice. It was some other more senior person who I'd gone to ask if they would do an independent study with me, and said, pick a junior professor who's just starting out and isn't burdened by a bunch of PhD students. And so I reached out to Goldgeier, and we did an independent study, or he supervised that my sophomore year. And then, what's the thing you learn in life is as time goes on, an age gap, which was about 10 years, which then seemed like, generations apart. You get.
He was so young.
Yeah, but it over time, that 10 years ain't that long anymore, right? And then, we collaborated more frequently on articles and projects, and then did this book together, which was one of the most fun things I've been able to do professionally. So this is I would kind of treat this time here as a beginning, right? This is you're going to all work with one another over the years. You're going to work with us, and that's one of the great blessings of being able to be here at Beaver Creek for this week. Okay, so now trying to propel the story forward from 9/11, which is Jim and I, our project kind of left off. Our epilogue talks about kind of the implications we saw moving forward of these years as the debates of the 2000s were playing out. But to propel this forward to 11/9, which November 9th, 2016, which it was shortly after midnight, early morning of November 9th, that Donald Trump walked onto the stage in New York, much to everyone's surprise, including his own, having been elected president. And if you're trying to think of this time as kind of as a distinct period, I mean, what we were trying to do in our book is say, rather than dismiss the 1990s, what we call the modern interwar years, as the holiday from history, as a period of time where nothing really significant happened, it was just all sort of adrift from this dramatic moments at the end of the Cold War to the dramatic moments of 9/11 and the immediate aftermath of 9/11. That you really needed to understand what was happening in the 90s to have a sense of what the debates were, why the debates unfolded the way they did. In the 2000s, everything from the way we were approaching the use of force to democracy promotion to trade to the invasion of Iraq. Okay, so then thinking forward to the Trump election and the Trump era, we haven't written this part. We played with the idea of maybe we're going to do a revised edition or volume 2 of the book, but playing this forward from 9/11 to the new 11/9, because many people are saying now it's the end of an era, or it's the beginning of something completely new. And you could argue that Trump's election is truly the end of the post-Cold War era. You had the Cold War, the post-Cold War, and now we are in the post-Cold War. But so we can argue whether that makes sense or not. But for the purposes of today, what I thought I would do to propel this forward is go into some detail about Barack Obama's rise and the way he looked at the world, because I think it's a useful lens both to reflect back on the debates of the 11/9 and 9/11 period, to think about the debates of the 2000s, and then also the Obama presidency, and also what we're struggling with today, because there's some themes that connect throughout these periods. So of course, it really starts with Iraq, and Iraq was the issue that propelled Obama's rise, right? Most famously, 2002, he gives a speech as a no one had ever heard of Barack Obama, state legislator in Illinois, in Chicago, at this anti-war rally. I think, if memory serves, John Mearsheimer also spoke at this rally, and it was from that speech then he gets more prominent nationally, speaks at the 2004 convention, and we're sort of off to the races. And the way he talked about Iraq was that this wasn't just a failure of Bush. This wasn't sort of what was the common sort of thought in Democratic circles was the Iraq War was kind of cooked up in the evil lab of Dick Cheney, and was thrust upon the American people, and that was kind of, it was a gross caricature of how we got into that struggle. And Obama actually didn't buy it. He saw it as actually something deeper in terms of the problem was more systemic than something you could just blame an individual or some craven folks for. So of course he gives us this 2002 speech, but what I found interesting, and I confess this was a speech he gave that I had paid no attention to in 2007. He gave a speech at DePaul University on the 5th anniversary of that 2002 speech. And this was while he was running, and he actually gave the speech at DePaul first, and then he gave it twice more that day. So he gave it 3 times in one day, a long foreign policy address, to try to drive the point home. And what he says in that speech is there are themes that you heard throughout his presidency and you still hear today coming from a different direction. Because he talks about how the American people weren't just failed by a president with Iraq, they were failed by much of Washington, by a media that too often reported spin instead of facts, and by a foreign policy elite that largely boarded the bandwagon for war and gave the president open-ended authority to do so. Now, a lot of these themes carried through his campaign, obviously, and then into his presidency, and he returned to them often as president. A lot of the establishment critiques that came at President Obama early on in his presidency, they really kind of irked him. He would read the op-ed pages and get kind of pissed off, and would try to kind of work over some of these critics and try to convince them. Later in his presidency, as his frustration grew, he began to talk more publicly about his frustrations. And I think the most important, and really confront these head on, and the most important speech he gave that reflects this, I think, is a speech actually Jim hosted at AU in August of 2015. That was Obama's main speech in defense of the Iran nuclear deal. And it's interesting because in that speech, he reflects back consciously to he says in 2002, he gave a speech on Iraq. And he said, and then he repeated those themes. He ran for president 8 years ago, who opposed the Iraq war. And he talked about, it was not enough just to end the Iraq war in his mind. He wanted to end the, quote, mindset that led to the Iraq war. And I dug up this speech. I was rereading these quotes, and it was striking how kind of they still resonate today. He talked about, this was a mindset characterized by a preference for military action over diplomacy, a mindset that put a premium on unilateral U.S. action over the painstaking work of building international consensus, a mindset that exaggerated threats beyond what the intelligence supported. Leaders did not level with the American people about the costs of war, insisting that we could easily impose our will on a part of the world with a profoundly different culture and history. And of course, those calling for war labeled themselves strong and decisive while dismissing those who disagreed as weak. Again, these are themes that he had been talking about since 2002, and here he was at 2015, with the end of his presidency in his sights, defending what in his view was his most signature foreign policy achievement. And he was still pushing back against the same mindset, as he called it, that led to huge mistakes. Now, as I said, Obama would try to engage with critics on both sides. He would, Andy Bacevich come in for a one-on-one lunch in the dining room off the Oval Office. He also had Bob Kagan come in for a one-on-one lunch in the dining room off the Oval Office to try to engage their ideas. He'd have historians in, he would have leading political scientists come in to talk about these issues. And one phrase you often heard Obama say, and he says this in the Iran speech, is he was frustrated by a foreign policy debate that he said was not on the level. That it in his view was fundamentally a dishonest debate. And what was interesting about Obama is that he wasn't a kind of a McGovern, Democrat. He wasn't this kind of peacenik person. I mean, this guy, part of what the kind of the paradox of Obama, because I think many of the caricatures is that he's this McGovernite, kind of apologist for America. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, he's criticized as being someone who loves drones too much and got the U.S. militarily engaged in more places than it had been prior to him becoming president, which brings out some of these tensions within the Democratic Party that we saw during these years. But it's interesting that when Obama became president, despite his criticism of the establishment and his willingness to take it on, he embraced a lot of kind of mainstream democratic foreign policy thinking as president. And I think this helps explain some of the tensions that he faced as president and some of the contested debates we're having about his legacy. So, as I said, Obama's rise was more than a knee-jerk response to Bush and the Republicans and the mistakes of Iraq and elsewhere. And I really do see it as yet another chapter in this 25-year struggle to define America's role in the world after the Cold War. And fundamentally, the debate revolved around several core issues, or core questions, really. Obviously, how the U.S. should pursue its interests, how the exercise of American power can be reconciled with the limits of that power, and how we should talk about those limits. What, if anything, is necessary to justify U.S. actions abroad, so the legitimacy question. And then finally, how one defines strength. What does it mean to be strong in foreign policy? Now, not surprisingly, Obama was kind of underwhelmed by the 1990s. I think he wrote about the 1990s in a way that reflected, I think, the conventional wisdom that it was sort of a lost opportunity moment, that some good things happened, but what the kind of sum total of the foreign policy of the 1990s lacked any overarching themes or grand imperatives. And as he was rising, as Jim noted, in the post 9/11 years, as the early 2000s, really up until 2006 and 7, conservative foreign policy seemed ascendant. We seem to be back politically to the Cold War era, where it was the conservative side that was seen as weak and strong, strong and decisive, and the Democrats who were seen as weak. And for a time, this really worked, and liberals floundered. And the central lesson that Democrats took from the immediate post 9/11 years was that it was kind of a Cold War redux, that in order to be successful politically, Democrats needed to be, quote, strong and tough on foreign policy. And this was the core rationale of John Kerry's candidacy for president in 2004. I mean, he made his service in Vietnam at the center of his candidacy for president. And of course, that service and the controversy that was kicked up merely manufactured around that service. In many ways, the Swift boat controversy was a forerunner of some of the other manufactured controversies we've seen in political life. There's a direct line from Swift boats to birtherism to what's happening today. And what's interesting is that if you reflect back on the 2004 campaign, and I had a front row seat for that campaign, the one Democratic politician who emerged from that campaign as a star was Barack Obama from a 2004 convention speech. And that painful loss in 2004 led to a couple contradictory things that starts to reopen some of these debates from the 1990s that Democrats were struggling with. And you start to see the seeds of the divide that we should talk about what's happening today. First, on the one hand, you saw the lesson was Democrats need to be stronger, particularly in terms of the military. Okay, Kerry was a flawed candidate, but we Democrats had to be more serious when it comes to military issues. We need to think more deeply about it. For a variety of reasons, it had been seen that conservatives, Republicans particularly, kind of owned the military space. And Democrats needed to do better at that. And as a result, you had all sorts of efforts. Some of it happened in academia, some of it happened, new think tanks were formed. I was part of that at CNAS in 2007 when Michelle Flournoy and Kirk Campbell started CNAS. Although it was nonpartisan, it was explicitly driven to try to have progressives, center-left folks be more serious about military affairs. You had things like the Truman National Security Project start, which Pete Buttigieg actually was an early member of the Truman National Security Project in 2005 and 6. So that was one kind of response to the 2004 loss and the immediate post-9/11 years. The other came out from a different direction, which was kind of the new activist donor class in the Democratic Party, which was first tapping the power of the internet, and saw the problem with Democrats, not that they were too weak on the military, but they were actually culpable in the decisions the Bush administration had been making in Iraq and elsewhere, and that the mistake was trying to be too much like the Republicans, and that the Democrats needed to more accurately reflect a progressive worldview. And the roots of that debate go back to the huge controversies around the Kosovo intervention on the left, Bill Clinton's decision to bomb Iraq in 1998, which got largely forgotten in all the heat around the 2002-2003 lead up to the Iraq War, but was a hugely controversial moment in the Bill Clinton administration when he bombed Iraq in December '98. And of course, the continued drama over Bosnia. So we saw a return, really in the mid-2000s, say, of what in the 60s and late 60s, early 70s, we had the New Left in response to the Old Left, which was seen as two kind of establishment. In the mid-2000s, we had maybe the New Left. It was defined by MoveOn.org. And the campaign in 2008, leading up to, so it's 2006, 2007, was all about how to manage and harness the energy of this new donor class, while also trying to articulate a strategy that was more reflective of what I would say kind of mainstream Clintonian, Bill Clintonian Democratic thinking. And it caused huge divisions in the Democratic Party. And to me, a symbol of that, just as an individual, a symbol of that is the fate of Joe Lieberman. Right? Joe Lieberman was 250 votes in Florida away from being vice president of the United States in 2000. Runs, Democratic senator, longstanding, kind of the Democratic establishment, runs for president in 2004, does not do very well. And in 2006 gets primaried by Ned Lamont, who's now the governor of Connecticut. Gets primaried by a kind of an unknown, untested political figure, Ned Lamont, fueled by internet money, MoveOn.org support. Lieberman gets primaried, loses the Democratic primary, ends up running as an independent, wins election in 2006, and then he endorses John McCain for president in 2008. And just if you think about just the whipsaw of, here's a guy in 2000 was the vice presidential nominee who for a month thought he was going to be the vice president, who then 8 years later is kicked out of the party basically and endorses the Republican. And that's a sort of a symbol of what was happening in the 2000s in the Democrats. To the extent that Clinton's presidency had exorcised the ghosts of McGovern and made progressives more comfortable with American power, American leadership, intervention, democracy promotion, these new debates reopened these wounds. Now, and this is where Obama's sort of a unique figure, because his vocal stance against the Iraq War and the identity he had formed from the 2002 speech and that he used very consciously in 2007 gave him legitimacy among this new liberal class. But he wasn't a bleeding heart. And as I said, in fact, he drew on the thinking and the policy ideas of many mainstream, quote unquote, establishment Democratic foreign policy thinkers. So Obama embodied the hopes and ambitions of both sides. And they each were able to see in him what they believed the future needed to be. So therefore, he also reflected their contradictions. So there's a question of kind of, without an Obama-like figure, how can this stay together? Because in fact, when Obama, if you think of his policy agenda, when he becomes president, it's pretty much the policy agenda that had become mainstream Democratic foreign policy thinking in the 2000s. Responsible withdrawal from Iraq, not immediate withdrawal, responsible, basically, to be honest, more or less the policy that Obama inherited from President Bush in 2009 after the deal was cut to manage a withdrawal from Iraq with the Iraqis at the end of the Bush administration. Doubling down on the war in Afghanistan, talk about that, whether that was wise or not, but that was sort of mainstream Democratic thinking. Taking it to Al-Qaeda in a more meaningful way. The narrative of Democratic foreign policy thinking in the 2000s was we had taken our eye off the ball against Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan by the Iraq War. maintaining military strength while building up the other pillars of American power, the so-called 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development, revitalizing our core alliances, particularly with the Europeans, focusing on issues like climate change, nonproliferation, putting more emphasis, more diplomatic, military, political emphasis into the challenges of the Asia-Pacific, what was first called the pivot and then the rebalance. That was all kind of mainstream democratic foreign policy thinking in the 2000s that became the core of Obama's policy agenda as president. So, a key question that Obama grappled with and that the Democrats grappled with, that I think we are grappling with today is, what does it mean to be strong? Okay? Now, Obama answered this in three different ways. He said, first, there's a false choice between strength at home and strength abroad. This is kind of obvious, but in foreign policy debates, this tends to be a controversial point. But in order to be strong abroad, you've got to be strong at home, right? It's kind of intuitive. And he talked about nation building at home. Got a lot of criticism from folks, from friends of ours, for saying, we should be doing more nation building at home. Not to say we shouldn't be doing anything in the world, but when we think about what we're doing in the world, a true grand strategy is not just about foreign policy, it's about how your foreign policy matches to your domestic policy by connecting the dots. And he got criticized for doing talking about nation building at home. Now, from the perspective of today, I asked my friends who critiqued Obama talking about nation building at home 5 years ago, does anyone look at the last few years and argue we should have been doing less nation building at home in the 2009 to 2017 period? So, okay, first, to push back against this false choice between what we're doing at home and what we're doing abroad. Secondly, the idea that how you measure strength in what you're doing in the world is actually by being strong, not just talking the talk, right? And Obama, I think one of the challenges he faced as president was he had a very low tolerance for the kind of posturing and the theater of what we expect often in a president. And he was what most frustrated him about the Washington scene was this idea that kind of talking tough, mattered more than actually getting results. And third, that being strong and tough was almost always reduced to military action. That it wasn't about what you're really trying to achieve, it's whether you actually blew something up or not. Now, it's interesting, this is a whole nother talk, but I have a kind of a revisionist view on the whole Red Line episode. And I was reflecting on this yesterday when we were listening to Philip's talk and his framework for how to think about problem solving and this idea of having an operational objective and the actions you're going to achieve that operational objective. And I think of the Red Line, which was all about the disposition of Syria's significant chemical weapons arsenal. And in the Obamian view, the problem was what you do about Syria's chemical weapons. We had no good answers for it. The thought was you would use military force because that was probably going to be the only option. A diplomatic alternative emerged that dealt with that helped solve the problem in a way that was far beyond what we ever imagined possible, more than military force could have done. But yet that's still considered a failure. Happy to talk more about that. But he often then, towards the end of his presidency, would return to this whole question about what it means to be strong and how to think of strength. And what's interesting, there's another speech he gave at the UN General Assembly, September 2015. So place this in time. Donald Trump was a few months into his campaign. He actually, even as early as September, people were wondering, why is Donald Trump still in the race? Like, it's been a couple months. He should have left already. Like, hasn't he gotten what he wants out of this? Like, and why is he still around? And why is he even still leading in the polls, right? I don't get it. It's interesting, Obama was not surprised by that at all. And if you go back and look at this speech he gave in September of 2015 at the UN General Assembly, he's talking about, he doesn't do it, he does it very indirectly when he's talking about the US, but he talks about the kinds of politics that is kind of spreading in the world, focusing, of course, mostly on what's happening in places like Russia. where he's talking about kind of the return of strongman politics and the dangers that that poses. And he says in this speech to the world at the UN, says, we're not immune from this. And he said, look, we see in our debates, this is him, about America's role in the world, a notion of strength that's defined by opposition to old enemies, perceived threats, an Islam that's incompatible with peace. We see an argument made that the only strength that matters for the United States is bellicose words and shows of military force, that cooperation and diplomacy won't work. He talked about, again, September 2015, a politics and solidarity that depend on demonizing others, that draws on religious sectarianism and narrow tribalism or jingoism, may at times look like strength in the moment, but over time its weaknesses will be exposed. So he saw this coming. I mean, he was, and I remember I was in a conversation with him. This is after I'd left government. I was working on the book about his foreign policy, and I was included in a couple sessions that he had with journalists, kind of Jeff Goldberg types, off the record. But he's since said this more or less in public, so I'll repeat it. And there was a question where he said, somebody asked him. This is probably later in 2015. Somebody asked him, why do you think Donald Trump is still around? Like, what's going on? Why is he still, there hadn't been a primary or caucus yet, but they were wondering, why is Trump still leading in the polls? And Obama kind of looked at this, a crowd of familiar names to all of you, op-ed columnists and big thinkers. And he said, I don't know why all you guys are surprised by this. Because he said, if you've kind of been paying any attention the last few years, if you've been following the debate about what's been, just on Fox News, for example, he said, if you follow that debate, and that was really your main diet of information, said, I, Barack Obama, was not born in this country, or I'm a Muslim. Obamacare was, after it gets done destroying our economy, was going to establish a death panel that's going to, kill your grandparents. And climate change is scientifically unproven. So he's like, that's kind of been the mainstream. That's not some fringy thing. I mean, that's now what he's certainly on the Republican side. That was what folks were talking about. So he said it's not surprising to me that someone who's a master entertainer, who's really good at promotion, is willing to say anything, is doing well. Now, where Obama was wrong, and I'll be very interested to see how, when his book, whenever it comes out and sells a gazillion copies, what he says about this. But at that time, he was confining that to the Republican side. He was saying so he's like, it's not surprising to me that Donald Trump is he said he'll probably be the nominee, right? But he thought that was just a recipe for electoral disaster. And obviously that was wrong. So just kind of the question, and what's his diagnosis of how we got Trump? That's a different question than foreign policy, of course, alone. But as I said, so he would return to this debate about strength frequently towards the end of his presidency. Okay, now let me do quickly about what Obama inherited, and then fast forward very quickly to today. So I think if you think of Obama's inheritance in 2009, and this was kind of right at the moment that Jim and I's book came out, Obama liked to talk about being president. It's like being a relay racer, where you inherit a situation you can do nothing about. You get the baton from the previous runner. You've got your leg of the race to run. It's going to be 4 years, it's going to be 8 years, maybe it's going to be less. But you do the best you can, and then turn over to the next person in the most responsible way possible, and then it's the next person's leg of the race to run. And by almost every measure, the situation he inherited in 2009 was pretty tough, right? I'm a fan of the book and the movie The Big Short, and if you think of kind of the state of America in 2009 and what we had just been through, or we were in the middle of going through with the financial crisis, 800,000 people were losing their jobs a month in January 2009. Millions of people have been tossed out of their homes. We had sort of gone through this weird fantasy period in a way where we thought that money literally grew on trees, that you could own a $500,000 home with no money down, making $40,000 a year, and that somehow seemed to work. Now, of course, that we learned a very hard lesson there. But at the same time, if you think about it on foreign policy, we also had been engaged in a fantasy year, or fantasy years, where we thought we could fight a war basically on the cheap, in military terms, on supplemental budgets, right? So we would pay in this war basically on a credit card without a lot of sacrifice. And those chickens came home to roost. So just as kind of troubled asset was a euphemism that was used in the financial terms to talk about the fundamental illness in our financial markets. Troubled asset also is kind of a useful term for what the instruments of American power in 2009. So Obama, of course, his first order of business was to arrest the decline and reverse that trend. And I think on a lot of measures he succeeded in doing so. But I do think the foreign policy debate that he first started to kind of take to task in 2002, and then more openly, of course, in his race for president in 2007 and 2008, the foreign policy debate never really, it always made it kind of harder. As I was reflecting after I left the government and just kind of what I'd been through, and I had the time to read again, I read a book that I guess I had read probably in college, but I'd forgotten it, and I think it's even out of print now, by Les Gelb and Tony Lake and Mac Dessler. And it's called Our Own Worst Enemy, The Unmaking of American Foreign Policy, and it was published, I think, in 1984. And I would highly recommend finding that somewhere. I actually got it on bought it Remainder from the Columbia Library, for like $1 in 1995. So I don't even know if it's still in the Columbia Library. I may have the copy, but I'd find it, and it was very prescient about. I mean, this was, and again, who Les Gelb and Tony Lake is and Mac Dessler. These are kind of practitioners, scholars. Tony, of course, went on to be National Security Advisor for President Clinton. Really. Speaking in very alarming terms about the state of the foreign policy debate in the 80s. And as I was reflecting on this 20 years later or so, or 15 years later, it was pretty prescient and pretty striking for today. And they talked about kind of the attributes of what they call the foreign policy breakdown, where political play acting, this is their word, political play acting is more rewarded than hard work. And speech making passes for serious policy making. And foreign policy debates give more weight to ideological certainties rather than the ambiguities of reality. And foreign policy elites help drive policy in domestic politics and push debates towards the extremes. And this sounds very similar to Obama. And Obama wrote a book, in his campaign book, which I must confess, I dismissed at the time as a campaign book that's kind of like written by people like us, that the candidate really doesn't have much to do with. It's called The Audacity of Hope. I read it after I left the government. And there's some of that in there, but a lot of it's Obama. A lot of it is, he wrote it. And he talks about in this book, and this was published in 2007 or 2008, I guess. He talks about the coarsening of American politics. And he says the spin, the amplification of conflict, the indiscriminate search for scandal and miscues, the cumulative impact of all this is to erode any agreed upon standards for judging the truth. He wrote about that. That was 2007, 2008. And then he later said, as president, when interviewed, he said, for me to satisfy the cable news hype fest would lead us to making worse and worse decisions over time. So Obama was an optimist about America in the world. He was an optimist about America, right? He famously, the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice stuff. He was an optimist about the strength and wisdom of the American people, but he believed that too often the political debate stood in our own way, right? We were our own worst enemy, which brings us to today. Okay, now I'm going to skip Trump for the moment because we could go down the rabbit hole of Trump like we do frequently. Happy to get into, Jim and I can offer our thoughts of what we think Trump, kind of how he reflects the debates that we wrote about and we've been thinking about. Jim asked the question, though, where is the Republican Party of the Bush 41 crowd? It's interesting. I think, actually, last Sunday they were in this room, right? Where there was a group of folks who were kind of the Never-Trumpers who met here in Beaver Creek to try to figure out what the hell they're going to do with themselves over the next few years. And I don't know. Democrats got a lot of problems. Happy to talk about those, but I wouldn't want to trade places. But so let me offer a couple quick observations about where I think we are today and what all this means. And sort of as we think of the Obama legacy, and what he's left, and the debates we're having today and the Democrats are having today, and how we're thinking about America's role in the world, what all this can mean for us moving forward. And then I think for all of you, as political scientists and historians, how to think about your work in helping us navigate this way forward. I mean, in some ways, for folks in our line of work, this is like our Super Bowl, because the stakes are huge, right? I mean, what happens in the next few years is going to be a big deal to our children, right? And I think we all suffer from presentism, and this moment's like none other, and and I always try to, as a good historically minded person, try to check myself from that. But I think we can all agree that these are pretty choppy waters that we're in right now. So some quick observations. I'll do just 5 on where we are in terms of America's role in the world and kind of the legacy forward. First, and I'll try to keep it optimistic too, because we can easily drive ourselves down into a pretty depressive place. First, on the optimistic side, there is still a demand in the world for American engagement, right? I work at an organization now where half of our employees are overseas, they're not Americans, and traveling around, more often than not, you hear a lot of concern about the direction of the United States, and folks want to hear reassurance that it's all going to get better, that America's not going to disappear. There's a few corners of the world where people are saying good riddance, or it's about time, or you're going to get what you deserve. But for the most part, you see a world that sees the value of an engaged United States, and that's a blessing, right? There's not many countries that ask for more of China. They want China. I mean, they'll take Chinese money, investment, but they're not. It's a different kind of desire than what they're asking for the United States, and they're worried that the U.S. is gonna withdraw completely. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at public opinion polling, if you look at even the recent elections, the midterm elections in 2018, you don't see a lot of popular support for Trump's foreign policy. I mean, or initiatives. I mean, support for like alliances like NATO remain really high, right? And they were always high, but that's those numbers have really stayed north of 85% support for NATO. You see deep skepticism of the president's embrace of Putin, right? And you're seeing that reflected in Congress, certainly, as well as public opinion. Concern about tariffs, right? And even those who are suffering from tariffs, they're still with Trump on the, they're still supporting Trump, but they're kind of waiting this out, and they're not happy with the tariffs, right? Now, it's unclear whether voters are going to punish the president for all this, but again, there's just not a lot of evidence of support, and I take that as an optimistic conclusion here. And if anything, I think you see a lot of kind of cognitive dissonance or selective listening when it comes to this administration's foreign policy or accommodation about Trump's behavior. When I look at the Democrats, I think that there are the fissures that Obama was able to kind of cloak in a way between the what I call the new left and the kind of mainstream Democrats are opening, but in part because of Trump, they're not as severe as it doesn't feel that we're not having the same intense foreign policy debate on the Democratic side that we did in 2006 and 2007, right? And in part that's because there's not the Iraq War, but I do think there is a bit of an Obama consensus on the Democratic side in terms of security issues. There's a large degree of continuity. If you think of the three most important strategic arenas to the United States: Asia, the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East, there's a lot of continuity. Whether it's the support for what used to be called the rebalance, right? And actually, and this is an area where I think there's a lot of continuity from Obama through Trump. In Europe, the idea that the U.S. needs to be actively engaged in European security issues. On the Democratic side, supportive of the European political and economic integration project, need to have sustained military deployments and even increase those military deployments in Europe. Lots of support among Democrats on that. In the Middle East, similarly, support for a sustained U.S. presence, but no appetite for major U.S. military involvement there, or kind of, and I think, again, continuity largely in terms of where Obama left things on ISIS and Syria. So a willingness to use military power as a precise tool, and kind of maintaining a steady pace of lethality. Now, I'm putting Sanders out of this. Now, Sanders, in my mind, is not a Democrat because he's not a Democrat. But he's if you think of kind of the mainstream Democratic thinking, there's still a lot of support and continuity for all of that. There's wide agreement that the kind of nation building at home agenda needs to be front and center. You're seeing talk of need to have a middle class foreign policy, and greater balance between foreign and domestic priorities. I think one of the more interesting things to watch in the primary for Democrats will be the conversation around the defense budget. I think, and I mean, so far you've seen some hints at, we should have some arbitrary cuts, but I think for the most part that's being handled responsibly so far. But I think that could be a pain point. Certainly there's an embrace, this is kind of the odd things of Trump too, there's an embrace of kind of defying the foreign policy conventional wisdom. So again, it was Barack Obama who got crushed in 2007 when he said in a debate, I would meet unconditionally with the Cubans and others, and they said, "Oh my God, you can't do that." And now it's like engaging with the enemy is in. Now maybe Trump will so thoroughly discredit that no one will ever do it again. But the point is this whole idea that you can never talk to your enemies. That we're in a different debate right now. So you're not going to hear Democrats saying we shouldn't talk to the North Koreans. So they criticize Trump and how they're doing it. And then also, and this gets to Jim's question on he talked about on trade in particular, this view that the kind of the optimism of globalization of the 1990s that carried through in the 2000s, that went overboard. That the thought that the losers of globalization, which Bill Clinton talked about in 1992, as he talked about trying to make the American workforce more relevant to the 21st century, and books like Robert Reich's The Work of Nations, who was kind of one of the intellectual blueprints of Bill Clinton's economic ideas, that the losers of globalization, the folks who would be displaced, would be easier to help. Right? I think there was an underappreciation and wide acknowledgement today that there was an underappreciation for the ramifications of globalization. There's a view that the bet on China did not pay off. We heard that in spades from Charlie Edel the other night. Now, there's people like Jim Steinberg have a very different view on that, but I think what we've all seen is the conventional wisdom has turned very hard against China. That the idea in the 1990s that the politics of fear and grievance could be held in check. I mean, as Jim noted, this politics has been with us for a long time, and of course it precedes the end of the Cold War. You can go back to McCarthy and the debates of the 1930s. But the idea that could be held in check, and that also this idea in the 1990s that kind of tragedy could be transcended. That kind of conflict, we were always going to have conflict, but it would not rise to these kind of a shock, such a shock to the system. That all of that has been largely discredited. And then finally, or two more points. Finally, or second to finally, is sort of this idea of how we should think about foreign policy leadership. And now this is I'm working on a project now looking at Eisenhower and Bush 41 and Obama and trying to think of them as a leadership cohort, as leaders who all struggled with very similar foreign policy debates, who struggled with how you have an ambitious foreign policy that is about projecting American power in the world, but doing so very mindful of the limits of your power, mistakes you can make, and how you talk about that, and whether you can talk about it, whether our politics will allow leaders to talk about it in a way that's on the level, as Obama would say, right? Jim Steinberg suggested yesterday, we were talking about kind of what you want out of an ideal policy process, that we just got to get off the kind of the hamster wheel of instant gratification and like the analogy I used with Obama is Obama was kind of like a Warren Buffett type thinker. He was a long range thinker, thinking, look, it's not about like following the market day to day. It's about making sound investments and playing for the future. But our politics is increasingly a day trader politics, right? It's a minute to minute, up or down, how are things going, and it's all short term. And he, of course, Obama tried very hard to push back against that and resist it, but he paid a political price for it. So, one wonders whether kind of the outgrowth of the current moment and whatever becomes of the Trump years, and I don't think the story is going to end well, however it ends, we kind of sober up and we reset in our thinking about what we think of foreign policy leadership. And that's where I think Eisenhower and Bush 41 are really interesting, because, of course, those are presidents that left office with a basically with a narrative that they were weak and indecisive and out of touch and all of that. But yet their legacies on foreign policy have only gotten better over time. And so one wonders how Obama will hold up that way. And then finally, and this is an optimistic point to end on, I think that where we are today, there has been a renewed kind of civic engagement and focus on the health of American democracy and the role of American leadership in solving problems. It's an amazing thing, and it's a very positive thing that people who were completely uninvolved in politics, people who 2 years ago would have been at a conference like this, who had careers in the government or think tanks, who ran for office, raised millions of dollars and won elections and flipped seats. And the fact that more people are subscribing to newspapers and it's been this kind of counterintuitive thing. It's the worst of times, but it's the best of times for journalism or for think tanks even, right? As more funding is flowing in because the problems seem so profound, there's more folks engaging in civic debate, kind of keeping up the habits of democracy that have been so essential to America's global success. Now, look, a lot of this feels like it hangs in the balance, in that we'll see what happens, how the next 18 months play out. And I think if the last, few weeks are any indication, it is going to be really ugly. But as I try to navigate my own way psychologically through these times, I try to hang on those positive data points, which leads me to kind of trying to be in the Obamian frame of mind of being a long-term optimist about the country and to remind myself, as good historians would, that we've been through really tough times before and even tougher times, right? And we've navigated a way out and actually found a way not just to get out of it, but to improve and self-renew. And I think that's kind of the most important idea we should leave with. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.